Have you ever felt like with the world changing so rapidly and with so much information coming at us all the time, um, it's hard to, hold on to those ideas that really matter.
Yeah.
It's like we're constantly having to reevaluate the things we thought we knew in light of all this change.
That feeling you're describing, that challenge of trying to find solid ground when everything's shifting while still valuing what lasts, well, that's actually a perfect way to introduce what we're going to be diving into today. It's something that thinkers have wrestled with for centuries.
Right. And today we're going deep into 20th century modern Confucianism.
Yes.
Now, I think when most people hear Confucianism, they probably think about, ancient China and wise sages and those classic texts. But what's really interesting about this modern version is how these thinkers acted as real-world philosophers.
Absolutely.
They weren't just stuck in ivory towers. They were deeply engaged with how Western thought and the huge wave of modernization were impacting Chinese culture.
And it wasn't just some abstract intellectual exercise either. Looking at the sources we've got, it's clear that this was deeply personal for them. They felt this real responsibility to make sure that their philosophical tradition, this rich tradition, remained relevant in a world that was transforming dramatically. It wasn't just about preserving the past. They were actively doing philosophy, grappling with new questions in a totally new context.
Yeah, absolutely. And to understand this movement, we need to understand these four key figures: Xiang Shili, Mu Zongsan, Tang Junyi, and Xu Figuan.
Yes.
And these weren't just, quiet scholars. They lived through some massively turbulent times, like the fall of the empire, devastating wars, the rise of communism.
Right?
All of these huge events shaped the questions they were asking, the answers they were searching for. They were philosophers living through and responding to major historical upheaval.
And their journeys, their philosophical responses to these challenges, well, there's something really valuable there for us today. It's not just ancient history. It's about understanding how these brilliant minds navigated a clash of ideas and cultures. And honestly, that's something so many of us still struggle with.
Exactly. I mean, it's relevant to how we figure out that balance between tradition and being modern, right? I feel like that's a struggle a lot of us can relate to.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, their perspective on Western thought was really surprising. It wasn't just, oh, the West is great. There was a lot of admiration, but also some really sharp and insightful critique.
It's fascinating how they use their deep understanding of both Western philosophy and Confucianism to come up with entirely new approaches to some pretty basic philosophical questions, like their views on knowledge, on human nature, even on democracy. It's a totally fresh perspective.
So what we're going to do in this deep dive is unpack their main ideas, see where they agreed, see where they disagreed,
Yes.
and ultimately try to understand their shared goal to make sure that this profound wisdom, this enduring value of Chinese thought, wouldn't just disappear under the force of, this rapid modernization. Okay, so maybe we can start with the massive historical shift they were responding to.
Okay, let's start there with this confrontation between modernity and tradition. As you mentioned, these thinkers experienced incredible upheaval. Events like the Opium Wars, the collapse of the Qing dynasty, the emergence of these new political ideologies, they really forced people to question traditional Chinese culture at its very core. There were intellectuals at the time who believed that tradition was actually an obstacle to progress, that it needed to be completely abandoned.
Wow, that's a really intense level of scrutiny, right? We're to question the very foundation of your culture.
It was. And modern Confucianism really emerged as a direct response to that sentiment. These philosophers, they stepped up to defend the value of Chinese tradition, especially Confucianism, but they weren't arguing for blind resistance to change. They believed that Confucianism could be a solid foundation for modernization, even help improve it. That it could accommodate things like science and democracy, things that were seen as the keys to Western success.
So they were walking a tightrope, right? Wanting to preserve the essence of their tradition, but also understanding that they needed to adapt and evolve in a changing world.
Exactly. And they were also very analytical about the differences they saw between Chinese and Western cultures. A common thread among them was this analysis that Western culture, being heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, excelled in areas like, acquiring knowledge, logical analysis, and using reason in practical ways.
Right.
Mo Zongsan, for example, he talked about the analytic spirit of the fulfillment of reason in the West, this inherent tendency to abstract things and separate the subject and object in inquiry.
And he also talked about the constructive presentation of reason in the West.
Right. Yes, exactly.
This focus on building consistent intellectual and institutional systems.
Right.
like democratic governments and the scientific method, where you evaluate them based on their procedures and consistency, not just on the results they produce immediately.
Precisely. And their argument, as philosophers reflecting on this, was that Chinese culture historically didn't emphasize this detached objectivity or developing these formal systems, and they felt that this had actually hindered the development of modern institutions in China. Xu Guan kind of echoed this. He saw the ancient Greek focus on the pursuit of knowledge as central to Western intellectual tradition. He even referenced, Bacon's famous quote, "knowledge is power." And he argued that this pursuit of knowledge with the aim of achieving power was a defining characteristic of modern Western culture.
Whereas in China, the whole purpose of learning was different.
Yes.
It wasn't about accumulating knowledge for its own sake or for practical application in that same way, but more about cultivating moral character and ethical practice. Even philosophy was largely geared towards realizing morality in action, in the world, rather than just perfecting abstract theoretical systems.
Exactly. And because of this focus on moral self-cultivation, forms of knowledge that didn't have a clear connection to moral practice were often, though not always, seen as less important. And this, they argued, is a big reason why the kind of value-neutral investigation of the natural world that led to the scientific revolution didn't really take hold in China in the same way.
It seems like Tang Juni maybe went the furthest in exploring these cultural differences.
Yes.
He saw culture as a uniquely human thing, a manifestation of our spiritual activity, consciously shaped by ideals and purposes.
What's interesting is how he defines spirit. The mind actively affirming an ideal and then striving to bring that ideal into reality. He saw so many cultural practices, from family structures to the economy to art, as products of these human attempts to realize specific ideals. And he also thought that you could actually evaluate those ideals based on their reasonableness and how well they fit with human nature and our moral intuitions.
And while they admired aspects of Western modernity, especially the advancements in science and the focus on individual freedom, they also had some pretty big criticisms.
Right.
They were worried about excessive individualism and a lack of moral and spiritual grounding in the West.
Their concern was that fully embracing Western ways of thinking and living would be a mistake, that it would lead to the loss of something really essential from Chinese culture. They were searching for a way to integrate the good things about modernity while preserving and even furthering the core ideals of their own traditions. Tang's analysis of Western culture is helpful here. He argued that the West did achieve a lot in non-humanistic fields, science, math, but it was lacking in developing a deep humanism, which he defined as affirming the inherent value of human nature, individual personality, relationships, and the importance of history.
He felt that Western humanism often relied too much on external authorities, like God or natural order, and didn't truly put the virtuous person at the center.
Exactly. He saw it as always being pulled between, on the one hand, the objective lens of science, and on the other hand, the religious idea of original sin.
Right.
He argued that the most solid foundation for humanism had to be the inherent value of each individual human being, rooted in the moral capacity of the mind that everyone has. He believed this was the unique strength of the Chinese humanist tradition. He acknowledged that Christianity initially recognized the dignity of each person, but then argued that a religion focused on a god couldn't ultimately be a stable foundation for humanism, because it put a higher value on the divine than on the individual.
And he saw modern Western culture often going in the opposite and possibly dangerous direction, treating individuals as objects of scientific study and analysis and losing sight of the subjective and spiritual sides of human experience. This overemphasis on the material aspects of life, he felt, led to things like utilitarianism, where satisfying desires was the main goal, and a type of individualism that focused too much on being unique and not enough on our shared humanity.
This critique of utilitarianism and overvaluing desires is a big part of modern Confucianism. These thinkers believed that Chinese culture uniquely recognized and valued the fact that humans have values and aspirations that go way beyond just fulfilling their basic needs.
Right.
Xu Guan was very clear that Western utilitarian individualism had nothing in common with the values of Chinese culture, emphasizing the importance of the heart-mind as something different from and superior to fleeting desires.
Mu Zhanshan made a similar point, right?
Yes, he did.
He was very careful to distinguish between basic biological desires and fundamental moral values, seeing them as two completely different categories of human experience.
Yes, he did.
And even Xiang Shili, though he didn't focus on utilitarianism directly, consistently criticized any philosophy that treated humans as just objects to be studied. Instead, he advocated for finding wisdom within yourself by exploring your own fundamental nature.
Right, it really comes down to this. While they saw the value of some modern achievements, they felt modernity was often lacking morally, and that Chinese culture, with its focus on the inner spiritual value of humanity, was crucial to preserve and even share with the world. This commitment to Chinese values, this sense of cultural nationalism, it's a key feature of modern Confucianism. They believed that the strength of their tradition was in its evaluation of the person as a subject with worth and dignity, and that modernization should enhance, not diminish, this understanding of what it means to be human.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about how they approached the idea of knowledge itself. It seems like they made a really important distinction between gaining knowledge about the outside world
Yeah.
and cultivating a deep understanding of morality.
Yes, they did. And this actually reflects some older Confucian ideas, like the traditional distinction between knowledge from senses, like seeing and hearing, and the deeper knowledge of our inherently virtuous nature.
Okay.
While each philosopher had his own nuances, they all agreed that morality and values couldn't be grasped through purely objective, empirical, or scientific methods. They weren't dismissing science.
Right.
They acknowledged its value in understanding the natural world, but they maintained that science alone couldn't lead to an understanding of ethical principles and moral conduct.
So they weren't saying that there are no moral truths or that all moral viewpoints are equal, right?
No, not at all. They believed in the objective reality of moral truths and our human capacity to understand them. However, they insisted that this moral knowledge had to be approached differently, often drawing on the intuitive approach of the Ming Dynasty philosopher Wang Yangming.
Okay.
She actually made a fundamental distinction between what he called wisdom, the direct understanding of reality or the mind's true nature, and discernment, our everyday knowledge of the world around us. He emphasized the non-dual nature of true wisdom, this lack of separation between the self and reality.
He also talked about derivative knowledge and direct knowledge, highlighting the importance of this internal, non-conceptual way of knowing reality.
Right.
He believed that any attempt to grasp ultimate reality objectively, as if it were just an object outside of us, would fail to achieve true understanding.
Exactly. And building on that, Zhu Fuguan introduced the concept of embodied recognition, a direct, deeply felt awareness, which he linked to Mencius's descriptions of moral feelings like compassion and shame. He argued that the reality of these moral feelings was self-evident and didn't need external justification. If science couldn't explain them, then that was a limitation of science, not a denial of the reality of those feelings.
It's an interesting way of turning the tables on the relationship between science and morality. He saw the moral and cognitive aspects of the heart-mind as distinct but connected. Cognitive knowledge gives us facts about the world, but just having those facts doesn't automatically lead to a moral response or ethical action.
That's important.
Yeah.
Jus acknowledged the importance of cognitive knowledge, especially in understanding the objects of moral concern and figuring out how to act morally in the world. But he insisted that true value was in the moral practice itself, not just in knowing things. Tang Juni, with his system of 9 cognitive horizons, also made a distinction between moral knowledge, which is the self-awareness of our humane heart-mind, and the empirical knowledge of the world that we gain through our senses and study.
And he was clear that empirical knowledge, though valuable, needed to be guided by moral understanding, not the other way around.
Yes, exactly. He put scientific inquiry lower in his cognitive framework than conscious moral practice. He was emphasizing that observing and understanding the world isn't enough. We have a moral imperative to actively engage with the world and try to improve it.
His concept of effective connection is also central to his thinking. He described it as the direct meeting of the mind with the objects of cognition.
Right.
Not just a subjective experience,
Right.
but a genuine connection to a wider reality. It suggests a fundamental interconnectedness between the mind and the world.
Yes, it does.
It's fascinating, this idea that by truly understanding the world, we also understand ourselves better, and that understanding the subjective realm requires lived experience, not just detached analysis.
It is. Mu Zongsan, while agreeing with the limitations of science and understanding morality, focused on rigorously justifying our knowledge of free will and the objective reality of morality, which he felt Kant hadn't fully done. For Kant, free will was beyond the realm of knowable things.
Right.
But Mu argued that the truth of free will and moral obligation had to be understood practically through our moral actions, not just through reasoning. He saw autonomy, being free from desires and external forces, as essential for morality to even exist. And he turned Kant's argument around, suggesting that because we experience morality, we can know that autonomy and free will are real. He proposed intellectual intuition, a kind of non-sensory intuition directed at our autonomous self. He argued that our spontaneous moral responses are actually this intellectual intuition in action.
So when we see what's morally right in a situation, it's not just a random thought. It's a direct instance of this knowledge of our true self and its capacity for good.
Exactly. Mu emphasized that this practical moral knowledge is intentional, meaning it's subject-dependent, unlike the truths we discover about the world through observation. But, and the sources point this out, this reliance on intuition does raise questions about how we can tell genuine moral insight from cultural conditioning or just strong feelings, and his argument about autonomy does depend on accepting a Kantian framework.
It seems clear that these modern Confucian philosophers were really committed to defending the reality and accessibility of moral knowledge in a world increasingly dominated by scientific and materialistic views.
Yeah.
Let's move on to their ideas about human nature.
Okay, so the question of human nature has a long history in Chinese philosophy.
Right.
And the modern Confucians engaged with it deeply, positioning their views in relation to thinkers like Confucius, Mencius, and Wang Yangming. They generally favored the mentioned view that human nature is inherently good, and Wang Yangming's emphasis on finding moral values within one's own mind.
They were really big on this idea that humans have an innate tendency toward moral thought and action, and that realizing this tendency is central to being human.
Yes.
The ideal of the sage, the perfect moral example, remained important for all of them.
They faced two big challenges in their time.
Okay.
First, the attacks on traditional Chinese culture and the uncertainty of values that came with modernization. And second, what they saw as a lack of moral depth in Western culture, especially in utilitarianism and naturalism, which seemed to reduce human worth to things like happiness or survival.
Tang Juni's quote about the importance of affirming the intrinsic value of the human spirit, not just its usefulness for achieving other things, captures their concern.
Yes, it does.
They were really worried about anything that blurred the lines between humans and animals or reduced morality to calculations.
Exactly. This led them to reject Buddhist and Darwinian views of human nature. Zhang Xili, for instance, critiqued the Buddhist idea of innate evil, arguing that human nature is pure and good and that evil comes from acquired habits that we can overcome. He also disagreed with Darwinian evolution, partly because it blurred the lines between humans and animals, and partly because the idea of constant competition for survival didn't fit with his view of the interconnectedness of life. He even cited a Confucian saying that stressed the need for mutual support among living beings.
So Xiong set the stage by defending the goodness of human nature. But how did Mu, Tang, and Zhu explain this goodness and how we realize it in our lives? The issue of desires seems important here. How do they differentiate between selfish desires and the moral responses they believed were part of our nature?
Because you're right, if human nature is just all of our natural feelings and behaviors, it's hard to deny the power of self-interest. Both Mu and Tang, drawing inspiration from Kant, proposed a two-tiered model of the self. There's the empirical self, the source of our desires and experiences, and a deeper true self, which is defined by our capacity for moral responses.
Okay.
They argued that this true self is on a higher level of reality and represents our most authentic being, the part we should try to understand and follow. For both of them, experiencing genuine moral responses was how we grasp the reality of this true self. Mu, with his moral metaphysics, even argued that morality is the basis for our understanding of the autonomous self, which exists beyond sensory appearances.
Okay.
He distinguished between everyday feelings and rational feelings or ontological moral feelings that belong to this true self. He used the classic Mencius example of someone feeling alarm and compassion for a child about to fall into a well to illustrate these moral responses. For Mu, this isn't just an emotion, it's a moment of reflective verification where we become aware of our true self and are moved to act morally. He even saw it as intellectual and intuition in action.
But, as the sources point out, it can be difficult to separate these intellectual feelings from our selfish desires or cultural norms. If morality isn't based on universal principles, but on following our moral mind, how do we know we're accessing it correctly?
That's a very good question. Tang Juni, who also proposed a two-tiered self, took a different route to show the reality of this higher self. His key idea was effective connection with other beings, especially other humans. He saw this interconnectedness as the foundation of morality.
Okay.
He argued that by recognizing the equal subjectivity of others, we transcend our self-interest and realize our deeper self. It's not about merging into a universal self, but about fully acknowledging the reality and value of other individuals as independent centers of experience. He illustrated this through various cultural activities, including science. While acknowledging the practical benefits of science, he argued that scientific inquiry itself, the pursuit of truth, the reliance on logic, the desire for shared understanding, presupposes our moral capacity to go beyond selfish desires and recognize other minds.
So for Tang, engaging in these activities is a manifestation of our higher self. But do we actually gain knowledge of others' experiences through effective connection? Or is it more like a foundational assumption that underpins our morality?
That's a question Tang grappled with. While he talked about a universal moral mind, he also sometimes referred to this belief as a kind of faith, something we affirm even if we can't prove it. He seemed to conclude that this faith in the possibility of goodness is essential for life to have meaning and for moral action to be possible.
Zhu Fuguan, unlike Mu and Tang, was less metaphysical. He rejected applying Western metaphysics to Chinese philosophy and didn't propose a two-tiered self. He agreed that morality was supra-empirical, but not necessarily transcendental. He focused on the human capacity for self-mastery and self-cultivation, distinguishing between basic desires and the responses of the heart-mind. He also used the example of the compassionate reaction to a child in danger to show that moral feelings aren't just selfish desires, but manifestations of our heart-mind. Interestingly, he suggested that observing what we admire in others, especially leaders, might be a better guide to understanding our moral nature than looking at our own actions, which can be biased.
That focus on our preference for virtue in leaders connects to the Confucian ideal of rule by virtuous leaders. Zhu argued that democracy, with its emphasis on accountability and consent, is a way to make this virtue objective, to move beyond relying solely on the morality of individual rulers, and to create institutions that respect human dignity. He even argued that democracy, by limiting the power of those who govern, could be seen as the realization of the Confucian ideal of rule by virtue.
It's fascinating to see how each of these thinkers dealt with the question of human nature and morality. Now let's turn to their political thought, especially their views on democracy, which were surprisingly positive.
Yes, their political thought is often overlooked. Despite the lack of democratic institutions in traditional Confucian societies, Mu, Tang, and Xu all argued that democracy was not only compatible with Confucian values, but also a necessary step in its evolution. This was especially significant given their opposition to communism and their disappointment with the nationalist government in Taiwan.
They were really trying to find a middle ground, a third way that went beyond those dominant ideologies.
Exactly. They were responding to the communist rejection of individual morality, to the argument that Chinese culture couldn't support democracy, and to the nationalist government's authoritarianism, which claimed to be upholding Chinese tradition. Their efforts to justify democracy from a Confucian perspective aimed to show that it wasn't just a Western idea, but could be rooted in Chinese values.
Mo Zongsan's idea of an indirect connection between Confucian ethics and democracy is really interesting. He argued that traditional Confucianism might have been wrong to assume a direct link between the virtue of leaders and good governance.
His concept of the self-restriction of morality in politics is key here. He believed that for democracy to work, moral reasoning had to limit its direct influence on politics, to allow for the development of objective political institutions and procedures. Democracy, for him, isn't primarily a moral system in the same way Confucianism is. Participating in democracy isn't just for the virtuous. The strength of democracy is in its ability to embody virtues like fairness and accountability within its institutions, rather than relying on the morality of individual leaders.
So this indirect connection, where moral principles step back to allow for neutral structures, actually serves the broader aims of morality better than imposing specific ideals onto politics.
Exactly. And Mo based his argument on Mencius's belief in the goodness of human nature, suggesting that a democratic government that allows for participation and protects freedom is most likely to help people reach their moral potential. Tang Jini also argued for democracy, emphasizing the moral equality of all people and the need for impartial institutions. But he also brought in his idea of effective connection and the recognition of others' subjectivity as justification for democracy.
He argued that political equality rests on the universal capacity for moral thought and action. which he believed was a fundamental assumption of human social interaction.
One of Tang's points was that even the desire for power, when you think about it, recognizes the existence of other wills and values in society.
Right.
By seeking and using power and by needing to persuade others, the selfish heart mind can become more ethical and public-spirited.
Okay.
He also stressed that democracy can't just rely on good institutions. It also needs a foundation of shared morality and civic virtue among citizens.
Zhu Fuguan, focusing on the Confucian values of human life and well-being, argued that the main duty of government is to respect human dignity and ensure people's basic needs are met. He believed that the Confucian ideals of human dignity and equality supported a liberal democratic order. He argued that while traditional Confucianism relied on the virtue of rulers, democracy, with its checks and balances and popular sovereignty, institutionalizes respect for human dignity, removing the dangers of relying on the character of individual leaders. He even said that democracy, by limiting government power, is the modern realization of the Confucian ideal of benevolent rule by virtue. But he didn't advocate for purely procedural democracy. He felt that Western democracies sometimes failed to see individuals as moral beings. He believed that a good democracy, inspired by Confucianism, should recognize individuals as moral beings, adding a virtue dimension to politics.
These modern Confucian philosophers were deeply engaged in trying to reconcile their tradition with the modern world. They offered unique arguments for democracy based on Confucian ideas.
So to sum up our deep dive into modern Confucianism, we've seen how these thinkers were focused on bridging the gap between Chinese tradition and Western modernity. They engaged with Western philosophy, offering both praise and criticism.
We looked at their ideas about knowledge, their distinction between moral and cognitive knowledge, and their emphasis on intuitive moral understanding. We discussed their models of the self, the two-tiered self, and the more unified view, and their shared belief in the inherent goodness of human morality.
And we examined their arguments for democracy based on ideas like self-restriction, recognizing the subjectivity of others, and the idea that democracy can realize the Confucian ideal of rule by virtue.
This leads to a final question for you to consider.
Okay.
Given their critiques of Western thought, how could these philosophers' ideas offer new perspectives on the problems we face today, like social division or the focus on material things?
Could the Confucian focus on inner moral development and the interconnectedness of people provide a valuable alternative to purely individualistic or structural solutions to social problems?
And in a world still struggling with tradition and progress, what lessons can we learn from these 20th century philosophers who tried to bridge different ways of thinking?
We encourage you to explore the ideas and lives of these thinkers. There's a lot to learn from their efforts to find meaning and value in a changing world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.